On a sweltering summer afternoon in 1877, the vast Monument Valley lay under an eerie silence. The sun scorched the crimson cliffs, making the whole desert seem ablaze under its searing light. Mary Ellen Hammond's pack mule plodded along through the sage and cactus, her cloak streaked with fine red dust. She was returning from the trading post in Mexican Hat, a familiar trip she had walked in silence ever since her husband, Thomas Hammond, was killed. Just 6 months earlier, the Navajo had descended on their ranch like a storm. They dragged Thomas into the yard, beat him, then scalped him at the front steps, leaving his mutilated body as a warning to any white settler who dared to claim Navajo land. Mary Ellen buried him herself, under the twisted juniper tree behind the house, her fingers bloody and torn from digging into the rock-hard soil. That night, she swore over his grave. She would never forgive the Navajo. Never. But today, the real storm came. She could feel it in her bones when the air suddenly went still. The mule skittishly tossed its head. The wind picked up and then roared, lifting columns of red dust high into the sky and swallowing the sun. Mary Ellen bent low, clinging to the animal's mane, as sand burned her eyes and seared her lungs. For a moment it felt as if the world itself was collapsing, and she prayed without thinking, though she no longer believed God was listening. When the wind finally died down, only a silent, desolate wasteland of sand remained. The mule was gone, vanished into the storm with all her supplies, but she was alive. Mary Ellen exhaled, brushed the grit from her skirt, and turned to search for her animal, when she heard it, a faint, broken sound. Crying. She froze, her heart tight in her chest. That cry didn't sound like a trap, didn't sound like some calculated bait to lure the kind-hearted to their death. It was simply the desperate sound of a small, helpless creature. Mary Ellen drew her pistol, stepping slowly toward the sound through the towering red rocks that looked like temples of the old gods. Behind an overturned army supply wagon, she saw her. A girl, no more than 4 years old, Navajo, curled up in the sand and blood, staring at her with wide, black eyes that clung to her as though begging for mercy. In that moment, every memory of her husband, every oath of vengeance, every lesson she'd ever learned that the only good Indian is a dead Indian, came crashing down on her. She should have walked away. Let the child die in the sand as justice for all she'd lost. But she couldn't look away. Those weren't the eyes of an enemy. They were just the eyes of a child, full of fear and pain, the same as any child anywhere. Mary Ellen lowered her pistol, staring at the girl for a long moment. Then she crouched down and slowly extended her hand. "Don't be afraid. I'll take you home," she whispered, though even she didn't yet know what choice she had just made. The child's hand trembled in Mary Ellen's, fever-hot and feather-light, like a tiny bird too weak to fly. Her skin was dry and burned with heat like desert stone. Mary Ellen realized immediately the girl was feverish, and if she didn't get help soon, she'd be dead before nightfall. But as Mary Ellen lifted her, faces flashed before her eyes. Thomas, her husband, his blue eyes wide with terror, his lips still trying to speak as they dragged him from the doorstep. His scream still echoed in her ears. The coppery stench of his blood still clung to every breath she took. Her own breath grew heavy. She clutched the child tighter, then felt herself wanting to let go. A tiny, broken voice rose up from the little girl in soft, unfamiliar Navajo syllables, like wind whispering through canyon walls. And those eyes held no hatred, no guile, only pure, primal fear and pain. Mary Ellen's gaze drifted down to the girl's bare feet, cracked and bleeding, to her tattered traditional dress, smeared with dirt and blood, its beadwork loose but still catching the sunlight like ashes of something once beautiful. Around them lay bodies, Navajo men, women, their braids cut, their limbs torn, left for the vultures. And Mary Ellen understood. This wasn't the scene of an attack. This was the aftermath of a massacre. Mary Ellen froze. Whispers from Mexican Hat came back to her. Bounty hunters scouring the land. $100 for every scalp. No questions asked if it came from a warrior or a child. Clean up the territory, they called it. And the broken bodies at her feet were proof of what civilization looked like. She looked back down at the child, and for the first time in a long time, her rage faltered. The girl shifted weakly, coughing, her dry lips cracking as she called, Mary Ellen guessed, for her mother. Mary Ellen drew in a deep breath. The hatred that had filled her chest for so long clawed at her like a cornered beast. She could let it loose, and let it devour the child. She could turn away, leave her to die and call it justice. But she stayed. And in that moment, she knew. She did not want to be that kind of person. She pulled her shawl around the little girl, cradling her against her chest. The child trembled like a willow branch, but her thin fingers clung tightly to Mary Ellen's blouse. Mary Ellen spoke softly, not knowing if she was speaking to the girl, to her late husband, or to herself. "We're going home, no matter what comes." And she turned and began walking slowly back across the desert. On the red sand, her footprints and the faint, tiny imprints of the child's feet trailed side by side into the distance. It was already dark when Mary Ellen finally saw the faint glow of her adobe roof in the distance. A thin sliver of moon hung overhead, casting her and the child into two long black streaks on the sand. The mule had not returned. The supplies and food were gone, swept away by the storm and the animal's stubborn flight. But now, in her arms, this fragile little life was the only thing that mattered. When she pushed open the creaky wooden door, the little house smelled of earth and old smoke. Still the same place. Where she'd once heard Thomas's laughter, where she'd once dreamed of children she never had. She laid the child gently on the narrow bed in the empty room. The room she and Thomas had once prepared for the son fate had never given them. The girl whimpered, her black eyes clouded with fever. Cold sweat dampened her matted dark hair, her cracked lips whispering Navajo words Mary Ellen couldn't understand. But she knew well enough. This fever was dangerous, and if it didn't break by morning, it would take her. She moved quickly to the kitchen, stoking the fire, drawing fresh water from the well. Just months ago, these same hands had gripped a rifle, ready to shoot any Navajo who came near. Now those same hands trembled as they wiped the child's burning forehead, stirred salt into water, soaked cloths, and soothed her in a gentle tone Mary Ellen thought had died with her husband. All night, she stayed by the bed, too afraid to sleep. The fever flared and ebbed, leaving the girl shivering and whispering what Mary Ellen could only guess were her mother's name and family. Each time, she held the tiny hand tight, as if afraid letting go would mean losing her forever. That night, the little house felt strange. Somewhere in the silence, she thought she could almost hear the laughter of the child she once wished for, mixed with the faint call of the desert wind at the window. In that quiet, she thought she saw Thomas's eyes, soft and forgiving, shimmering faintly on the rough wall, watching over both of them. At dawn, the rooster crowed. Mary Ellen startled awake, her head resting in her hands, and realized the fever had broken. The girl's black eyes blinked open, tired but clearer now. She looked at Mary Ellen for a long time, then whispered, her English halting, "Mama?" Mary Ellen froze, her heart aching. She smiled faintly, brushing the girl's cheek. "That's right. Mama's here." The little girl closed her eyes again, still clutching Mary Ellen's hand, and slipped into the first deep sleep since the storm. Mary Ellen remained sitting there, watching the child she had just saved, quietly wondering about the reckless choice that had brought her to this moment. And in that moment, for the first time in 6 dark months, she felt something small and fragile begin to stir in her chest, as though a seed of life had been planted. The first days passed slowly, like the quiet rhythm of the desert itself. The child gradually regained her strength, but remained strangely silent, as if the storm and the blood of her family had swept all laughter from her forever. Each morning, Mary Ellen would bring a bowl of cornmeal porridge and a glass of well water to her bed, gently helping her sit up, patiently feeding her 1 spoonful at a time. At first, the girl barely touched it, but by the 3rd day, her cracked lips finally formed halting English. "Thank you." Mary Ellen froze, her hand instinctively tightening around the tiny fingers that reached for her. A flicker of warmth stirred in her chest, something she thought she would never feel again. On the 4th day, the child was strong enough to leave the bed. She didn't say much, just sat quietly in the shade of the porch, her dark eyes following Mary Ellen's every move as she worked the garden. When Mary Ellen watered the struggling tomatoes, mounded soil around the bean plants, and pulled weeds from the squash, the girl watched intently, her gaze wide and deep as though she were memorizing every gesture. That afternoon, as Mary Ellen stooped to pluck weeds, she noticed a small shadow at her side. The girl was crouched next to her thin fingers lightly touching the wilted leaves of a bean plant. She looked up at Mary Ellen with a questioning expression, then softly murmured something in Navajo, her voice like wind through a canyon. Mary Ellen didn't understand, but she guessed what the girl was asking. She glanced at the parched soil around the roots and replied aloud, as much to herself as to the child. "Maybe too little water, or too much sun. Plants are mysterious things, little one." The girl stood and walked to the well. Mary Ellen watched, puzzled, as the child heaved the bucket up from the depths, her tiny hands straining but determined, and carried it back to the bean plant, looking up at her expectantly. Mary Ellen couldn't help but laugh softly. She nodded, then showed the girl how to pour the water slowly at the base of the plant. The child imitated her exactly, her small face solemn and intent, as though the entire desert depended on her hands. From that day forward, she became Mary Ellen's quiet little shadow. She began picking up tools Mary Ellen set down, steadying bowls as she kneaded dough, moving calmly around the chickens so as not to spook them. She learned Mary Ellen's every gesture, each nod and shake of the head, each slow, careful motion. On the 7th day, as the sky blazed red with sunset, Mary Ellen heard her whisper 2 simple words, slowly but clearly. "Mama, good." Mary Ellen stood very still. In those dark eyes, she saw a fragile but steadfast trust, as if the girl had finally found a place to belong, even if only for now. Mary Ellen knelt, resting her hand gently on the girl's shoulder. And for the first time since the night Thomas was killed, her heart felt still. As if the storm had passed, as if, amidst all the loss, she was planting something new, something alive. On the 8th night, Mary Ellen woke with a start to feel a tiny hand lightly touching her shoulder. Moonlight streamed through the window, catching the child's dark, glistening eyes, wide and strange. She stood there, her thin shoulders trembling, her lips moving. Mary Ellen sat up, her voice soft. "What is it, little one?" The girl didn't answer. She took Mary Ellen's hand and led her to the window. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly under a near full moon, silver light bathing the red rocks like sleeping gods. The breeze carried the faint scent of sage. The child pressed herself against Mary Ellen, pointing into the blurry horizon. Then, in her halting English, she whispered, "Man, good. Say sorry." Mary Ellen felt her blood run cold. She squinted into the darkness, but saw only stillness. No riders, no shadows, just wind and sand. She turned to the child, gripping her small shoulders. Who did you see? Which man?" The girl didn't seem afraid. She blinked, her face calm, then whispered again, "Man, your man. Come, dream." Mary Ellen's throat tightened, her hands trembled. "You dreamed of my husband?" The girl nodded slightly. Moonlight cast her small face in a way that made her look like a little desert goddess. "He say, desert, take many, but love, not take." Mary Ellen's tears slipped free, her heart aching and somehow lighter all at once. The girl leaned her head against Mary Ellen's arm, her voice a soft, prayer-like murmur. "He say, you hurt. Too long. Now. Time heal." Mary Ellen pulled her close, feeling the fragile but unyielding warmth of the child's body. For the first time in countless nights, she closed her eyes and whispered back, "Thomas, I hear you. I'll try to forgive." The next morning she walked to the back of the house, to the tree under which Thomas was buried. Kneeling down, she laid her hands flat on the sun-warmed earth and spoke softly to the wind. "I won't let hate consume me anymore. I promise." When she returned to the porch, the girl was sitting there on the wooden step, clutching the corn husk doll Mary Ellen had made her the day before. She looked up and smiled, the first true smile Mary Ellen had ever seen on those tiny lips. And in that moment she realized, last night, it wasn't just the child who'd been saved. She had been saved too, from the darkness in her own heart. 3 months had passed since the day Mary Ellen carried the Navajo child home. Life at the little ranch had settled into a fragile, quiet rhythm. The bean rows were greening again. The girl, whom Mary Ellen now called Shadi, grew bolder, picking up more English each day, learning to knead dough, tie up the chickens, even laugh when Mary Ellen spilled a bucket of water. Deep down, Mary Ellen began to believe. Maybe if fate allowed, she could raise her, teach her to read, to plant beans, give her a new life, untouched by the hatred of grown men. But the desert never forgets. And those who lost the child did not forget either. That morning, as she worked the tomato rows, hoofbeats rose in, the distance. At first she thought it was just a passing trading party, but then the sound thickened, multiplied, and thundered like a storm. She straightened, still holding her hoe, her heart pounding. Dust rose on the horizon. Silhouettes of riders emerged, a long line of figures draped in indigo and crimson, feathers swaying in their hair. In her eyes, she counted at least more than 150. The little girl came running out onto the porch, clutching at her skirt. Her dark eyes wide with fear, though she said nothing. Mary Ellen placed a steady hand on her head, motioning her back inside. But she herself did not move from the garden. The riders halted at the wooden gate, the desert wind carrying the smell of sweat and earth. The oldest man, his face lined deep with sun and wind, dismounted. His red woven blanket draped over his shoulders, his dark eyes holding hers for a long, long moment, then shifting to the small figure trembling in the doorway. Another man, younger, taller, a long scar cutting from his cheek to his neck, stepped forward, his voice rough. "White woman, took our daughter." Mary Ellen's lips tightened, but her eyes stayed bright and steady. She answered, calm, "I didn't take her. I saved her from dying." The elder's gaze flickered, not anger, but something else. Doubt, pain. He turned back, speaking in rapid Navajo to the others. The mounted warriors said nothing. The silence hung heavy as their collective stare fell on Mary Ellen and the child behind her. Mary Ellen's breath came slow. Her hand trembled slightly, but she kept Shadi behind her, steady. She knew one wrong word, one wrong move, and blood would soak this red ground again. Then the elder bowed his head and spoke softly. "She is of our blood. Paris, she called you mother." Mary Ellen blinked, feeling Shadi press closer to her skirt, the little lips forming one fragile word. "Mama." She gripped Shadi's hand, lowering her voice. "If you want her, I won't stop you. But let her speak." A heavy stillness. The warrior's eyes moved between them, then all settled on the child. Shadi timidly stepped out from behind Mary Ellen, looking up at the elder, her gaze carrying something far deeper than her few years. Then she turned, threw her arms around Mary Ellen, and said, weak but firm, "Mama, stay here." Mary Ellen knelt and held her tight. In that moment she knew those small words, and that child's steady gaze had swayed even the sternest riders. One by one, the 150 Navajo warriors bowed their heads, then slowly backed away, leaving the dusty yard to the woman and her daughter. The next day, the riders returned. This time they came quietly, without the thunder of hooves or clouds of dust. Just a small group, led once again by the elder draped in his red blanket. He dismounted and stepped into the yard, his gaze no longer tense, but heavy, like the desert at dusk. Mary Ellen waited for them on the porch, with Shadi clinging to her skirt as though she'd never let go. The elder gave a slight bow, his voice slow and rough. "We do not wish to take her by force, but we cannot forget where she belongs. We come to make terms." Mary Ellen's eyes stayed steady. "I don't want to keep her as my own. I only want her to live." The man nodded, his eyes softening. Then he lowered his voice, glancing at the child. "She has chosen to stay here, but she is a bridge. She cannot forget where she was born." Mary Ellen understood at once, and she knew the desert would never allow a child to be torn completely from her roots. She turned to Shadi, kneeling beside her. "Would you agree to go with them for a time? Then come back to me? Half the year with me, half with them?" Shadi hesitated. Her dark eyes shimmered, darting between her mother, the elder, and the endless white sands beyond. She trembled for a long moment, then nodded. The elder gripped his staff tighter and bowed his head slightly, as though releasing a great burden. He turned to Mary Ellen and said softly, "Half a year, with you. Half a year, with the tribe. Each season we change, until she is grown enough to choose." Mary Ellen drew a deep breath. She extended her hand. The elder took it firmly. There was no paper, no official decree from the territorial government to bind this fragile agreement. Only the honor of those who had both tasted loss and known love would keep it alive. As the sun began to sink behind the cliffs, the group quietly turned their horses and rode away. Just before disappearing, the elder paused, glancing back at Shadi, and said, "Keep your promise. Let her grow to know both sides of this world. And perhaps she will be the one to stop the bleeding." Mary Ellen held Shadi close, nodding. She said nothing, but silently prayed for the same. That night, as the desert wind howled through the cracks of the door, Mary Ellen dreamed of Thomas. He smiled at her, bowed his head in thanks, then turned and walked into a pale light. She woke, looking at the child asleep beside her, and knew she had taken the longest step of her life, not just to save Shadi, but to save her own heart. Time passed like desert sand, slowly, silently, but never stopping. Shadi grew up between two worlds, just as promised. Every summer and winter she stayed with Mary Ellen, tending the garden, herding the chickens under the trees, learning each letter her mother taught her. Every spring and autumn she went back to the tribe, learning their language, their ceremonies, how to read the sky and listen to the earth. Mary Ellen watched the little girl who once clung to her skirts grow into a poised young woman, her black hair falling to her back, her eyes still as deep as the desert night, but no longer timid. Shadi laughed more, her hands as capable of coaxing tender bean sprouts as they were at tracing tribal symbols in the sand. When Shadi turned 16, those two worlds met fully for the first time. That summer was cruelly dry, and tensions flared between settlers near Mexican Hat and the Navajo. A few fields were burned. A few herds of cattle were stolen. The local authorities sent Mary Ellen a letter. Avoid associating with the natives, for your own safety. But Mary Ellen was long past caring about their wary looks. She still welcomed Shadi home when summer came, still stood on the porch to see her smiling as she dismounted from a Navajo horse, still held her tight as though she'd never been away. That night, an angry mob of white settlers came to Mary Ellen's house, shouting for her to bring the girl out. They wanted her to answer for what her people had done. They carried torches. They carried guns. Mary Ellen stepped outside, Thomas's old hunting rifle in her hands. She stood firm on the porch, her eyes unflinching. "She's my daughter. She's done nothing wrong. If you want her, you'll have to go through me first." The man at the head of the mob met her gaze and saw the fire in her eyes. At last he spat, muttered something under his breath, and led them away, leaving the yard scarred with angry footprints. Shadi stood in the doorway, tears streaking her cheeks. Then she stepped out and took her mother's hand. In that moment her eyes were no longer a child's, but those of someone ready to stand beside her mother to protect their home. From that night on, Shadi began speaking more to her people about her white mother, about what she had done, about how she had taught her to love the land without letting hatred tear it apart. She became a true bridge, walking between the village and the town, translating words, explaining gestures, making the two worlds seem less alien to each other. Mary Ellen, watching her daughter grow into that young woman, understood. The choice she made in the storm years ago hadn't just saved a child. It had planted the seed of peace, fragile, small, in the very soil of blood and tears. And each night, as the desert wind whispered through the cracks, she smiled. She no longer dreamed of Thomas, but she believed he was smiling somewhere too, in the pale moonlight over Monument Valley. Mary Ellen Hammond passed away one quiet winter morning, as gently as she had lived her later years. She died in her sleep, just as the first light of dawn spilled over the cliffs of Monument Valley, leaving behind the humble adobe house where Shadi's footprints still marked the porch. In her hands lay the red woven blanket the Navajo elder had once given her in thanks. Word of her death spread quickly, carried over snow-dusted trails to the Navajo camp and the little town of Mexican Hat. On the day of her funeral, the land saw something it had never seen before. Two groups, two peoples, two worlds, gathered together to say goodbye. Navajo warriors in indigo robes, settlers in black coats, standing side by side on the yard, heads bowed as her simple wooden coffin was laid to rest beneath the juniper, next to where Thomas had been buried years before. Shanti, now a proud young woman in a hand-stitched Navajo dress, stepped forward. In her eyes shimmered memories, her mother's arms carrying her through a sandstorm, their first night on the porch, that trembling embrace surrounded by horsemen, the seasons spent walking between two worlds. Her voice rose, calm but trembling. Mary Ellen Hammond was my mother. But she wasn't just my mother. She was a mother to this land. She taught me that love is stronger than hate, that we don't have to kill each other to prove who deserves to live here. She turned, meeting the eyes of the Navajo warriors, then the white settlers. If anyone asks what she left behind, I will say, she left us a chance to stop bleeding, a chance to believe in people before we believe in skin. The crowd was silent. Only the desert wind moved, whispering through feathers on the warriors' headdresses. Shadi lowered her head, resting her hand gently on the coffin, and murmured, "Mama, I promise I won't let your words be lost to the dust." She rose, lifting her chin, her dark eyes fixed on the golden horizon, where the sun climbed above the red cliffs, casting light on both worlds she now walked between. There, Mary Ellen Hammond's legacy still lived, in the heart of a Navajo girl, and in the land that once soaked in blood, now dared to grow green again.